"To the future!" shouted Derek, raising a glass of 20-year-old single malt whiskey that belonged to my father. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, throwing long dancing shadows across the wooden walls of our old family cabin. "I got the final permits this morning," he announced, his voice full of unearned confidence. The voice of a man who has never faced real consequences. "We'll rip out this dusty interior, install glass walls, underfloor heating, and by spring we'll flip this thing for a $740,000 profit." My father Robert patted him on the shoulder and beamed. My sister Jennifer looked at her husband like he was a god. I sat in the corner, sipping lukewarm coffee, and said absolutely nothing. Because what Derek didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the property deed for this cabin was sitting in a fireproof safe in my apartment 3 hours away. And my name had been on it for 5 years, long before we watched Derek's house of cards collapse. Write me a comment and let me know which city you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The celebration in the cabin was deafening. It wasn't just joy, it was relief. My father saw salvation in Derek's vision. A chance to turn stagnant family wealth into a legacy of prosperity. He saw Derek's sharp suit and loud promises and mistook them for competence. He saw me in my gray sweater, quiet and observing, and saw nothing. Just Sarah, the quiet one, the accountant, the one without vision. My phone buzzed against my thigh, a single sharp vibration cutting through the noise. I pulled it out and shielded the screen from the room. It was a message from an unknown number. "Are you Sarah?" "Marco. I'm standing outside your cabin and your brother-in-law owes me $17,000. My stomach dropped, but my face remained completely expressionless. Years of forensic accounting had taught me one thing: never show your cards before the trap is set. I stood up and slipped through the French doors onto the porch. The cold mountain air hit me like a slap, freezing the breath in my lungs. It was snowing, heavy flakes drifting down into the black pine forest. I looked back through the glass. Inside, my father was pouring Derek another drink. Jennifer laughed, her hand on Derek's arm. It was a perfect tableau of a happy family, anchored in a lie. And it forced me to face the question I had buried for years. Why? Why did my father believe the loud liar more than the quiet doer? It's a trap that families like ours fall into so easily. The trap of normalizing cruelty. We confuse confidence with competence. We mistake silence for absence. Derek was a master of performance. He filled rooms with noise, with energy, with the appearance of success. And because he demanded attention, he received respect. I, on the other hand, demanded nothing. I solved problems in the dark. I paid bills quietly. And because I made it look easy, because I made problems disappear without fuss, my father assumed there were no problems at all. He didn't value the security I provided. He valued the excitement Derek promised. I looked at my phone again. "I'm outside," I typed back. "I'm coming down." I wasn't just walking out into the snow to meet a contractor. I was stepping out of the role they had assigned me. The quiet daughter was done. The forensic accountant was clocking in. The next morning, I sat in a booth at the only inn in town, watching steam rise from a black coffee rose up. Marco walked in 2 minutes late, looking exhausted and carrying a thick folder. He didn't look like a scammer. He looked like a man who had bills to pay and a bad feeling in his gut. He slid into the booth without greeting and pushed his phone across the table. "He said he wanted an open floor plan," Giuseppe said in a rough voice. "So yesterday we started demolishing the interior walls." I looked at the display and for a moment I forgot to breathe. The photo showed the main living room. The historic wooden beams, the hand-hewn supports that my mother had loved, the ones she traced with her fingertips while reading by the fire, were gone. Ripped out, piled up like trash in a dumpster. Derek hadn't just renovated the cabin. He had torn out its heart. He had erased this family's history to make room for generic modern aesthetics that would look good in a sales brochure. The anger that flared in my chest wasn't hot. It was absolute zero. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own folder. "Marco," I said with a steady voice. Derek Miller doesn't own this cabin. He never owned it. He never paid a cent in property taxes, and he certainly didn't inherit it. I slid the property deed across the worn laminate table. The date stamp was from 5 years ago. I bought it, I explained, watching his eyes widen as he read the legal text. When my mother died, my father stopped opening his mail. Grief paralyzed him. The bank was 3 weeks away from foreclosure. My siblings Jennifer and Derek were too busy living their loud, expensive life to notice that our inheritance was drowning in debt. So I stepped in. I didn't tell him the rest. I didn't tell him how I used my entire savings to pay off the arrears. How I quietly transferred the title to my name to protect the property from my father's creditors. How I let my father continue believing it was the family cabin, because taking away his dignity seemed like a cruelty I wasn't capable of. I had been the silent investor in their happiness for 5 years, and this was my reward. My brother-in-law was tearing down my walls to build up his own ego. He lied to you, I said, pointing to the property deed. And he destroyed my property. You will stop working immediately, and you will give me every single text message, email, and voicemail he sent you. Marco looked at the property deed, then at the photo of the destroyed beams, then at me. He owes me $17,000 for materials, he whispered. He owes you much more than that, I said. But right now he's about to find out that the owner is home. I drove back down the mountain with the evidence on the passenger seat. My mind switched from defense mode to attack, but before I could pull the trigger, I had to give my sister a chance. Jennifer was the optimist of the family, the one who believed in vision boards and manifesting destiny. I needed to know if she was an accomplice or just another victim. We met at a coffee shop near her house. She came in, glowing, radiating that manic bliss that usually precedes a breakdown. Can you believe it? She gushed, grabbing my hands across the table. Derek says the pre-sale interest is insane. We're going to be rich, Sarah. Finally. I pulled my hands back. Jennifer, listen to me. I was up at the cabin. Derek is destroying it. She waved her hand dismissively. He's modernizing it. You have to break a few eggs, right? It's just old wood. Belongs to modernize, I said, keeping my voice quiet. And it's not just about the cabin. I spoke with the contractor. Derek hasn't paid him. He's $17,000 in the hole, Jennifer. Her smile wavered, but then it hardened into something brittle. He's managing the cash flow. These things are complicated. You wouldn't understand. You're so risk-averse. I understand that he forged permits, I said. And I understand that he doesn't own the property. He's taking care of it, she snapped. Her voice grew louder. Why can't you just be happy for us? Why do you always have to be the buzzkill? You're just jealous because Derek has big ideas and you're stuck in your spreadsheets. Then she dropped the bomb that turned my concern into ice. We took out a second mortgage on our house, she said, lifting her chin defiantly, to bridge the gap until the cabin sells. Derek said it was a sure thing. He said we needed skin in the game. I stared at her. She had bet the roof over her children's heads to finance renovations on a house I owned, based on a lie told by a man who couldn't pay a contractor. Derek hadn't just scammed a stranger. He had weaponized my sister's trust to dig her a financial grave. He lied to you, I said quietly. You're just trying to ruin this, she hissed, standing up. You've always been jealous of him. Stay out of it, Sarah. She stormed out, leaving me alone with cold coffee and the terrible clarity of what had to happen next. I wasn't just fighting for a cabin anymore. I was fighting to save my sister from homelessness. The sister was gone. The forensic accountant was the only one still sitting at the table. I didn't go home to cry. I went home to work. I sat down at my dining table, opened my laptop, and logged into databases most people don't even know exist. Jennifer thought I was jealous. My father thought I was passive. They were about to learn that Sarah the accountant wasn't just a job title. It was a threat assessment. I started with a standard asset search. Derek Miller. The results populated the screen in a waterfall of red text. It wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. Derek didn't have a portfolio. He had a black hole. $57,600. That was the current sum of his unsecured debt. It wasn't a mortgage or student loan. It was maxed out credit cards, online gambling losses, and payments for a luxury car lease he couldn't afford. He was paying minimum amounts on 6 different cards, juggling balances like a clown on a unicycle. He was drowning, and like a drowning man, he had grabbed for the nearest floating object, my sister, and dragged her down with him. The second mortgage on Jennifer's house wasn't an investment strategy. It was a life preserver. He had burned her equity to pay his bookie or his Amex. And now he needed the cabin sale to plug the hole before the ground collapsed beneath them. I printed every page. Bankruptcy in 2014. A lien on a previous business venture. It was a pattern of failure masked by charisma. But while the digital paper trail was damning, it wasn't enough to stop him immediately. To involve the police, to secure an immediate arrest that would physically remove him from my property before he caused more damage, I needed evidence of criminal intent. He had to prove he wasn't just a bad businessman, but a thief. I grabbed my coat and keys. The digital audit was complete. It was time for the physical inspection. I drove back up the winding mountain road. The tires crunched on fresh snow. The silence in the car was heavy, filled only by the hum of the engine and the cold realization that my brother-in-law wasn't just a liar. He was a parasite. The cabin was quiet when I arrived. Marco had followed my instructions perfectly. The construction site was abandoned. The front door was unlocked. Derek's arrogance apparently didn't extend to basic security. I stepped inside. The smell of sawdust and drywall dust hit me immediately. Looked like a war zone. The walls I had painted with my mother were torn down to the wooden studs. The floorboards were covered with debris. But I didn't stop in the main room. I went straight to the master bedroom, to the spot above the fireplace where a large oil painting of the mountains used to hang. The painting lay on the floor leaning against the wall. The wall safe behind it, a small vintage box my grandfather had installed in the 60s, stood wide open. Froze. My breath caught in my throat. I walked over, my boots echoing on the subfloor, and peered inside. Me. The velvet bags were gone. My mother's vintage jewelry collection, the sapphire brooch she wore to weddings, her grandmother's pearl necklace, the gold locket with my father's picture, all gone. I leaned against the cold stone of the fireplace. A wave of nausea rolled over me. This wasn't just renovation fraud. This was grand larceny. But as the forensic accountant in my brain took over, the pieces came together into a terrifying psychological profile. This is the nature of narcissistic injury. Derek didn't just steal the jewelry because he needed $57,000. He stole it because he needed the costume of a successful man. He couldn't bear the psychological wound of being seen as a failure, as less. So he plundered our history to pay for his present. He pawned my mother's legacy to buy the appearance of prosperity, the champagne, the suits, the contractor deposits. He would rather be a criminal than ordinary. He would rather destroy my family than admit he was broke. This was the point of no return. He hadn't just made a bad business deal. He had violated the sanctuary of people who loved him. He had stolen the physical memory of my mother to feed his ego. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the empty safe. Then I called the local police station. "I need to report a burglary," I said, my voice as cold as the mountain air. "And I know exactly who did it." The sister who hesitated at the coffee shop was gone. The woman standing in the ruins of her mother's bedroom was ready to burn down the house to save it. 2 hours later, the snow was falling in sheets, a white curtain isolating the cabin from the rest of the world. But inside, the lights burned bright. Derek wasn't hiding. He was doubling down. Through the window I could see him pacing the main room, gesturing wildly to my father and a stranger in a suit. Probably the private investor he wanted to scam for a bridge loan to cover his debts before the law caught up with him. He was trying to sell a house he didn't own to pay a debt he couldn't service. It was the last desperate spin of the roulette wheel. I didn't knock. I used my key, the one I had carried on my keychain for 5 years, unnoticed by everyone. The door swung open, letting in a gust of icy wind. The conversation died instantly. Derek whirled around. His fake smile wavered for a fraction of a second before he tried to recover. "Sarah, perfect timing. We're just closing some." "No," I said. My voice cut through his noise like a blade. "We're closing." I stepped aside. Behind me, Marco came in looking grim. And behind him, 2 uniformed officers from the county police. The color drained from Derek's face so quickly he looked like a ghost. "What is this? A joke? Sarah, this is a business meeting." "It's an intervention," I said, walking to the table where he had spread out his forged construction plans. I dropped a heavy folder on the wood. It landed with the dull thud of a hammer. "This is the property deed for the land," I said, pointing to the first document. "Registered in my name, purchased from the estate 5 years ago. These are the building permits you forged. The permit numbers belong to a parking garage in Munich. And this." I pulled out the pawn shop receipts I had retrieved from the police database an hour earlier. "This is the receipt for Mom's sapphire brooch, her pearl necklace, and the gold locket." The silence in the room was absolute. My father Robert picked up the pawn shop receipt. His hands trembled. He looked at the date stamp 3 days ago. Then he looked at Derek. The hero worship in his eyes died, replaced by a horror so deep it looked like physical pain. "You stole her jewelry," my father whispered. "To pay for what?" "For appearances," I answered for him, because looking rich was more important to him than being honest. Derek collapsed. The arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a frightened, small man. He turned to my sister Jennifer, who stood by the kitchen island, clutching her stomach. "Jennifer, honey, listen, it's a misunderstanding. Can fix this. I just need a little time." Jennifer looked at him, then at me. And for the first time in her life, she found no excuse for him. She stepped back. "Mr. Miller," the officer said, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for fraud, document forgery, and grand larceny." As the handcuffs clicked, Derek began to scream, blaming the market, the contractor, me. But as they dragged him out into the snowstorm, his voice faded, swallowed by the wind. The cabin was finally quiet. The glass castle was shattered. A week later, the only sound in the cabin was the rhythmic scraping of sandpaper. Marco worked on the wooden beams, carefully restoring the wood Derek had tried to hide. It smelled of cedar and sawdust, the scent of healing. My father sat in the armchair by the fire. He looked older, deflated, the illusion that had kept him upright, the notion that his son-in-law was a titan of industry, was gone. "I owe you an apology," he said, staring into the flames. "Listen. I didn't offer him tea, no comfort. I offered him the truth." "Dad, look at this place," I said gently. "If I hadn't bought this cabin 5 years ago, the bank would have foreclosed. It would be a rental property for strangers now. If I hadn't intervened last week, Derek would have driven Jennifer's house into foreclosure too. You would be broke. Jennifer would be homeless. The jewelry would be gone forever. This is the reality of a world without the quiet ones. If I hadn't been the silent guardian, the safety net you didn't know existed, the family legacy would have been sold for scrap metal to pay for Derek's ego." "My silence wasn't absence, Dad," I said. "It was a shield." He nodded slowly. Tears carved their way through the wrinkles on his face. "I see you now, Sarah. I see you." Later that afternoon, I stood on the newly restored deck. The sun was setting, bathing the snow in shades of purple and gold. The jewelry was back in the safe. I had paid to retrieve it myself. Jennifer had filed for divorce and was staying with me until she got back on her feet. The cabin was secure. I wrapped my hands around a hot cup of coffee and took a deep breath of the thin, clean mountain air. Derek had wanted to sell this view for a quick profit, to show the world how smart he was. Instead, he showed the world exactly who he was, and I had stopped him without raising my voice. I watched as the first stars appeared above the tree line. Sometimes the quietest victories are the most complete. If this story reminded you that the quiet people often have the greatest power, then hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this. And tell me in the comments, would you have pressed charges against family, or would you have let them go?